was gambling in Havana.
I sometimes dream I'm body surfing. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama. In the summers, I'd go to Gulf Shores. I'd dive in, swim out to a sandbar, and I'd wait for the perfect wave. I love the sense of freedom and exhilaration I'd experience as I'd ride that wave all the way to shore. Then I'd climb out of the surf, I'd cross dunes with sand the color of sugar, and I'd rinse the salt water off of my sunburned, pale skin. My family was a stereotypical white Alabama family. My dad's family was sharecroppers during the Depression. I'm ashamed to admit, as a boy, I routinely used racial epithets. My hero was Stonewall Jackson. I dug up bullets in the Confederate trenches that surrounded Mobile. But starting with Boy Scouts, my narrow worldview began to crack. My swimming instructor was a black teenager. I was moved by his patience and kindness as he helped me pass the swim test. The experience challenged me because I'd been raised to believe that minorities were inferior. But in those rain-soaked piney woods with tannin-stained creeks the color of sweet tea, I had the not-so-profound realization that black kids were just like me. I went to high school in the early 1970s, a time of great social upheaval. The news was filled with campus protests against the Vietnam War. My worldview expanded as authors like Dalton Trumbo or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became my teachers. My senior year in high school, my family moved to Dallas. I lived at home during college because it was the cheapest option. I worked my way through college, starting at Richland, at one point working on an asphalt paving crew. I graduated from UTD with a political science degree, and I gained an increasing interest in world affairs. I went to SMU Law School because I wasn't sure how else to make a living. After graduation, I set up a law practice and signed up for court-appointed criminal cases. In my first jury trial, I represented an orderly in a nursing home who had sexually assaulted an old man. My client went to prison for 14 years. I wondered, is this what I'm going to do with my life? One day I was sitting at my desk when I got a call from Brad Ginter. Brad said he was a Mennonite missionary. Brad found out I was a court-appointed lawyer for a Salvadoran burglary defendant. He asked me, "Have you visited your client in jail?" And I went, "Yeah." And he asked me what I was going to do on his case. Somewhat irritated, I replied, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm sure you're aware of the Salvadoran Civil War." And I said, "Not really." He patiently described the wars in Central America and how he had come to work with refugees in Dallas. The idea that someone would commit to work with people fleeing war really inspired me. I said, "If you ever need help, give me a call," not really thinking he would. But he did. He asked if I'd help obtain guardianship for children whose parents were dead or missing in the Civil War, so the kids could enroll in school. I did, but I wanted to do more. My first asylum client was a Guatemalan woman whose husband was a labor leader, assassinated by a death squad. The husband had been pulled into an unmarked car and murdered. Then the widow started getting death threats. I helped her get asylum, and I was hooked. I felt the highest of all feelings, the feeling of significance. And when a client from the Congo once told me, "I know what you did for me. You gave me my life," I realized I was getting a lot more than I was giving. There is no better feeling than walking out of a courthouse and knowing that you had a hand in saving someone's life. So I took more cases, eventually through a local agency, Human Rights Initiative of North Texas. I loved hearing the stories of clients' perseverance and bravery. Once I had a client from an African country escape from a torture chamber. He was in a hotel lobby and a man noticed his wounds. The man said, "I never do this, but I'm going to be an old man someday, and I'll remember if I didn't help you." He was a ship captain, and he smuggled my client aboard a cargo ship. Days later, the captain came down and told him they were in the United States. "Can you swim?" he asked. My client crawled down a rope and swam to shore in the port of Houston. He knew one person in the United States, and he called and asked if he would come and get him. His friend replied, "I live in Michigan." But my client made his way to Dallas, where I represented him in obtaining asylum. My life continued to improve. When I was 28, I married my best friend, Jill, and we had 2 sons. My law practice was growing, and soon I was representing banks and small businesses. We bought a house and paid for school. I'd had to work my way through college, but my sons wouldn't have to. As I heard more stories about human rights abuses, I realized I could be a voice for international human rights right here in Dallas. I moved to not only representing individuals, but becoming an advocate for human rights. I wrote editorials for KERA about Aung San Suu Kyi and Burma. I marched outside the offices of the Dallas Morning News alongside Zimbabwean activists trying to call attention to the press of the efforts of Robert Mugabe to steal an election. I spoke to church groups about how, as Christians, they should care about human rights. And I spoke to the Dallas Bar Association, recruiting lawyers to do this fulfilling work. I then received another phone call. The executive director at Human Rights Initiative had left. Later that week, my wife and I were in the car, and I mentioned that job was available. She smiled knowingly and said, "You're thinking of applying for that, aren't you?" I'm a very lucky man because Jill did not hesitate in supporting my decision to take a much reduced paycheck. The transition from practicing law to leading a nonprofit was not easy. There were many brand new tricks for this 55-year-old dog to learn, like how to generate financial reports. But I quickly felt this was the right move. I was sitting in an intake room with a young woman from North Africa. Her husband had been trying to force her to abort their child, and he beat her badly. She escaped and went to a shelter. She showed up at our office with a few-week-old baby asking, "Can you help me?" Being able to say, "Yes, we can," made me feel so thankful because I now led a team dedicated to helping people just like her. Like that ship captain, I know I'm going to be an old man someday. My wife says, "You already are." I won't have to regret not using my law license to change lives. I was successful in practicing law, but the very best part of it all was the work I did with immigrants escaping violence. Finally, as I turned 60 this month, I get to do that every day. In 2014, an 11-year-old boy escaping gang violence in Honduras walked into my office. A few weeks ago, he stood smiling with me as he came to pick up his green card. That exhilarating feeling of freedom I experienced riding waves, that's exactly how I felt.